Okay, we wait just 1 or 2 more minutes so that people are together in. All right, I guess we'll get started. All right. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of the organizing committee, Caro, Joel, Giorgio, Matteo, Patrick, Stan, Angela, and me, a warm welcome to everyone to our 4th lecture of the Leipzig Lectures on Language series. The series, which you might now know, started last May and includes 9 fantastic tandems from different universities and research directions, which we'll list here once again on the welcome slide. The goal of the series is that of providing answers to questions like, what information do we combine in language? Is this process domain specific or domain general? How does the brain support combinatorics in language? How does combination takes place during language acquisition? What kind of cutting-edge empirical methods we bring us further? And how can theory influence experimental linguistics and vice versa? Our intention is that to wrap up suggestions and solutions from our invited speakers in the form of a symposium, which will take place on October 20th, 21st, in which we will center around 4 hands-on workshops on experimental approaches to language research. You can, of course, follow our updates on our Twitter account at Frederici Lab, and you can join on our newsletters and regularly check our website on the Max platform. I can see that we are quite a number of people now on Zoom and YouTube at the moment, so it's my personal pleasure to welcome the 4th tandem of the Leipzig Lectures on Language 2021, Songhee Kim and Liina Pylkkänen from the Medical College of Wisconsin and New York University, who today will give a talk titled Unpacking Composition, the Case of Adverbs and Verbs. Before getting over speakers, some info about our invited speakers today. Songhee Kim is a postdoctoral researcher at the Medical College of Wisconsin, with neurolinguistics and semantics as main area of study. Her dissertation focused on the neural representation of event concepts composition. Liina Pylkkänen is professor of linguistics and psychology and head of the neurolinguistics lab in New York University. Her research focused on the characterization of the brain mechanisms responsible for the semantic combinatorics of language and how they are intimately interweaved with computations building complex syntactic structures. As usual, the talk should have the form of a 10 to 15 minutes presentation by the senior researcher and about 30 minutes talk by the junior researcher. After that, we will have space for a few questions to be asked to our invited speakers. Before starting the talk, just a couple of info on the dynamics of the talk. So please keep your microphone muted. You can post your questions anytime into the YouTube or Zoom channel and chat, prefaced by Q. Junior researchers have priority, so please preface your questions with a Q&A. You can also post questions on Twitter using the hashtag LeipzigLang21. Members of the committee will gather the questions across the 3 platforms. We might have to filter questions in case many will arrive. And to increase interactions, we like to invite people who post their questions on Zoom to turn the microphone on and post the questions themselves to the speakers. In case the questions will be selected. We are also offering live captions, which you can enable on your personal Zoom. And I think it's enough from my side. So thank you for your attention. And now please welcome Songhee Kim and Liina Pylkkänen. So Liina, the stage is yours and you can now share your slides from your presentation. Thank you very much.
All right. Everything good? You can see
Perfectly.
you can hear me. Great. Thank you so much for the invitation and the introduction. So I'm supposed to be a little appetizer before Songhee's main presentation. So I decided to just try to answer the questions that the organizers posed for us in the invitation. And so here were the 3 questions that were in my invitation. What are prominent aspects of your theoretical framework? What information do we combine? And is this process domain specific and domain general? So all of these questions are very difficult. So let's see if we've learned anything about them in our research. Okay, what are prominent aspects of your theoretical framework? I'm going to rephrase this question a little bit and ask it in this way. What are the assumptions about representation and processing that inspire your research, that tell you what types of distinctions may characterize language in the brain, that allow you to get the project off the ground? And so now, one way that I can answer this question is to give you a little bit of a flavor of what I was up to as a graduate student. So this is one diagram, one figure from my dissertation, which was focused on how verbs combine with their arguments. I offered a theory about that for a certain set of constructions. This is an analysis of the sentence, Bill was told the news drunk. And it offers an explanation for why in this sentence, Bill has to be the drunk one, whereas if we have the active version of the sentence, I told Bill the news drunk, I have to be the drunk one. And so here, so this came out as an MIT Press monograph later, so my dissertation was from 2002 originally. And so in this work, what you see is very much an implementation of the Hyman-Kreutzer type compositional semantics. Okay, it's couched within a sort of generically Chomskyan syntax. I combined the Hyman-Kreutzer type formalism with event semantics of the Terry Parsons type. So I was very inspired by his book Events in the Semantics of English. And then finally, my work was hugely influenced by David Dowdy's word meaning and Montague grammar. So that's kind of like the toolbox that I had when I arrived in the cognitive neuroscience of language. Okay. So then let's ask the question, how do you use your theoretical framework? How can we use these kinds of representational theories in the neuroscience of language? So what I've given you is representational theories. They're not processing theories. They're not parsers. So here's, how I've used them. So we use the theory to inspire and guide experimentation. And I would say that if your theory does not inspire you, it's probably not a good tool for discovery for you. Maybe look for a more inspiring theory. So the representational theory gives us a hypothesis space about the representations that the brain needs to build. And in our work, we've of course been trying to discover neural traces of the actual building process. It's kind of how we've proceeded so far. So we use the theory to get the project off the ground, gives us some distinctions to work with initially. But the real work is not to map the theory onto the brain. There's a little bit of mapping as the first step as we're getting the project off the ground. So we first ask, do properties of these representations map onto anything in the brain? Can we get the project off the ground? But then if we find something to study, then we start investigating what computations actually underlie the observed neural signals. And so now that exercise may lead us to a very different place from whatever the theory originally said, but that's exciting. Now you're discovering things. If the brain simply confirms what the theory already said, you actually are not learning anything new, just confirming things. So just to say that in a slightly different way, so if you find something that correlates with, say, to pick a, an operation from Hyman-Kratzer, function application in the brain, it does not mean that you found function application in the brain. So the real work is probing the computation that's driving the signal, and that requires lots of systematic experimentation after the initial finding. So you're working towards a more and more mechanistic description of what's happening in the brain, and that work can be rather step-by-step incremental work. Okay, so we've done this exercise and we've asked first, is there neural activity that correlates with composition of either these syntactic or logical semantic structures? Because those were the kind of structures that I understood coming from linguistics into the cognitive neuroscience of language. I was able to design experiments that varied those types of structures. And so yes, there is neural activity that correlates to some extent with those types of operations. But then when you start probing into those activities further, and now I'm talking about specifically the left anterior temporal lobe, on which we've done a very systematic research program, we learned that they really don't track either syntactic or logical semantic composition in any general way. So that is, it's not the case that the signal in question is systematically observed every time you perform a merge or apply one of the combinatorial rules in your lambda calculus. Instead, the computation that seems to be performed in this neural signal that we started to study is not something that we learned about in linguistics. Okay, so now we have to move past the theory that we started with, but using linguistic theory was still crucial for getting the project off the ground. So it helped us design experiments. So second question, what information do we combine? So now I'm going to just tell you what we've learned from our work. So what are sort of conclusions that we can draw at this point? So the question is obviously incredibly difficult, so we're very humble. So just a reminder, so these are the types of operations that we started with, like we understood these operations, and so we design experiments bearing these operations. So this is the paradigm that we've ran with quite a lot. So in order to kind of simplify the task, a full sentence is a very, very complex representation, like you saw in my original tree from my dissertation. So here we're trying to get the project off the ground by identifying neural correlates of a single step of composition, like here, the combination of, say, an adjective with a noun. And so people are, for example, reading those stimuli in this original work word by word. You're not performing any judgment on the stimulus itself. The task stimulus comes later. So we're trying to just sort of measure natural processing, even though it's obviously in this very laboratory type setting. And then there's a kind of a list control and a one word control that is preceded by something that we think does not engage lexical access at all. And so from this kind of paradigm, we've observed a reasonably consistent correlate of composition in the left anterior temporal lobe. The precise locus of it varies to some extent in the kind of first half of the more anterior half of the temporal lobe, and so that's a bit challenging. But the generalization is that activity in that broadly construed region is increased in the presence of this composition. A somewhat less stable correlate is also observed in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and that we have not managed to study quite as systematically. Okay, so that so it could be either, logical semantics or syntax. Turns out it really doesn't seem to be either of those, because this activity is exquisitely sensitive to the actual conceptual properties of the composing items. And so those kinds of conceptual properties really aren't supposed to matter for syntactic composition or this kind of logical semantic composition. So in particular, what we've observed in a series of studies, so several studies have had this type of manipulation, is that the level of conceptual specificity of the composing items affect this activity. So here's one example of that. This is from Linmin Zhang's first study. So here if we're measuring the MEG responses to the second word, so dish here, the left ATL response is higher if the context item that is integrating into it is a more conceptually specific element like tomato than if it is a vaguer description like, or more general description like vegetable, and that gives you a higher signal. And that is not the type of variable that's supposed to matter for syntax or for logical semantics. And so that has then forced us to really seriously think about the more conceptual side of composition. And that's not something that, if you're trained in linguistics, you do not get trained in this. So now it gets a little uncomfortable because our expertise is not as solid. So here I'm just using those pictures to represent the more conceptual composition, since I don't have a neat formalism for it. So this activity, in fact, seems to reflect some variety of a more conceptually driven process. But, exactly what the mechanics of that is still very much an open question. So people seem very happy now to say that, oh, it's conceptual combination, but I would encourage you to not be happy with that level of description. That's still just, placeholder for an actual understanding. So what are some of the limits of this activity? How is it computationally constrained? So here we see, here I've already mentioned that whatever the mechanism is, it seems to see concepts in a way that syntax and logical semantics do not. So we feel like we can probably rule out any kind of purely structural explanation of this activity. And I have in the references that you see at the bottom, I've sort of sketched a more detailed hypothesis about how that might work. But what's more important for setting you up for Songhee's presentation is that this activity also seems to be limited to combinations that are in some sense semantically straightforward. And I really apologize for the super vague way of talking about it. For the linguists, who might be listening to this, it's a sort of a sense of direct composition where there's no bells and whistles, no type shifting, nothing fancy happening in that combinatory context. And the earliness of the activity is relevant here. So the left ATL activity in comprehension peaks very quickly. So, 150 to 250 milliseconds in that kind of early, almost like sensory time window. And so, it kind of makes sense that that early activity might only be able to do like sort of not fancy semantic composition. So let's just give you a little bit of a flavor of this from some of the studies that we've published. So here's the type of example that is an example of the red boat type composition. So Sally is a brown mouse. From this, it follows that Sally is brown. So that brown is a reasonably intersective adjective. And that's why that entailment holds. But if we say something like Sally is a large mouse, it doesn't follow that Sally is large. Sally's not objectively large in any sense. In fact, large by itself doesn't really mean much. Sally is a large mouse means Sally is large for a mouse. So you need to have that comparison set. So something a little more complicated is happening with large mouse than with brown mouse. And in fact, what we've observed is that when we're composing brown mouse, that seems to engage the left ATL, but large mouse does not engage the left ATL. So that was a study by Jaden Ziegler several years ago now. Word order matters here. So if somebody's thinking really quickly, they may have realized that, and that is true. So that's something that we saw in Graham Flick's more recent study. I should mention that Arnold Kothari did a version of the Ziegler study in Dutch, not the same design, but a similar design, and did not replicate these findings. So that's something to make a note of. So there's obviously life is not perfect. Things are more complicated eventually. Here's another example study that is relevant for setting you up for Songhee. So this is a study by Ava Portman, where she also kind of had a simple composition versus more complex composition contrast. So she looked at adjective conjunctions and found that intersective adjective conjunctions engage the left A tail, but collective ones do not. I'm not going to teach you that phenomenon here, but the important thing is that in this study, what she saw was that the collective ones, the kind of more complicated ones, they actually engage the right ATL. And that is now something that we're also seeing evidence of in Songhee's data. So what information do we combine? So we have from our work positive evidence in the left ATL for a neural index of some type of, I think, feature-based conceptual combination. So details to be fleshed out. So enriching the representation of an entity or an event, as you'll learn today, increases this signal. So that's sort of the generalization that we have. And that very much adds to the extant literature of the left ATL as a conceptual hub for single word concept processing. So this is, that's the broader context. And we also have a more recent set of papers that shows initial evidence for temporally, so that is in time, rather parallel engagement of the more posterior temporal cortex for syntactic structure building. So it's a topic that's very much trending right now. And so those are the empirical papers where we see that kind of sensitivity. And so stay tuned for that literature. Okay, so last question. Is this process domain specific or domain general? This is not a question that we have studied with any systematicity, but I have a couple of data points to contribute. And that is that what we've seen is that if you are presented with pictures of colored objects, which have a color feature and a shape feature or an object, kind feature, versus just outlines of those objects. So then you just get the object features, not the color feature. So for example, like this, like in one of Doug Bemis's studies. So here we have a red boat, and then we have an outline of the same boat. And here we obsessed about the matching the pixels. So there's even like the same number of red pixels in the background. And then in later studies, we didn't obsess about that. So this is another version of that contrast. It's actually a structural priming study. But if you are presented with this kind of a contrast, the colored objects will not elicit more left ATL activity unless the task is to name the picture. So you actually name red boat or just boat. So you're engaging language production. And we have many studies that show that the left ATL composition effects do extend to production, so that doesn't surprise us. But it does seem to be the case that just like comprehending or understanding the picture in a, say, conceptual task, which we've used, or just viewing it in a perceptual task is not enough to drive the left ATL. So that's pretty interesting. It's surprising, I would have banked on the other outcome. So there's really something to be worked out here. For most people who are sort of familiar with the prior like neuropsychological literature on the left ATL, they would definitely think that this should be a sort of generically conceptual as opposed to language linked in any way. There is a very recent paper by Anna Ivanova from MIT that actually shows converging evidence with this as well. So there's a puzzle to be worked out there. Okay, so here's sort of my measure of what it means to understand a neural signal, or that's like my personal kind of definition of that. And that is that sort of I ask, like, can I move it around in some predictable or sensible way? Can I make it go away? Can I change its latency? Can I change its amplitude? Once I can do those things, there's a feeling of like, okay, I kind of start to control the signal. I kind of know how it behaves. I know how to, move it around. So that's then you're starting to understand the signal. And so now Songhee will take the findings that we had from the noun domain, and she's going to test whether she can move the activity around during verb phrase processing in a way that kind of parallels the noun results, okay? And if she can do that, it would be pretty interesting. So it would suggest that the left ATL not only engages both for noun and verb phrase composition, that's kind of an easy thing to show. Like you do like eats, meets, read, boat. We already had shown that both of those engage the left ATL. But if we can actually get similar sensitivity at a kind of more fine-grained level, then that would suggest that it not only engages for both types of composition, but that it also potentially performs a rather similar function for these two categories. And so that is all I was going to say. And so I'm going to hand it over to Songhee. So take it away.
Hello, are you seeing my screen?
Yes, so perfect. Okay, now you can put
Okay,
it on
and
play
can you hear me well?
perfectly.
Okay, great.
Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you.
All
Perfect.
right.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the organizer for inviting us. Also, thank you for everyone who's listening. So yeah, I'm going to take over here and I'm going to talk about the adverb-verb combination and what we learned about LATL from them. Okay, let me just, okay. Okay, so here are 3 main points of this talk. So I'm going to show you some experimental evidence showing that the LATL computation is of cross-categorical nature, at least some environments that I tested. And semantic composition in the verb domain, as well as in the noun domain, just as we saw, localizes to the LATL, but not much to other candidate areas. Also, LATL can perform semantic composition even in the absence of local syntactic constituency. So briefly recap the computational profile of the LATL learned from the noun domain. So I don't know why, but okay, there seems to be like some delay with my key hitting. Anyway, so it's not syntactic activity, and also it's not logical semantic activity that the LATL is tracking. But instead, whenever there's a relatively straightforward integration of modifier into heads, and also there's if there's a large robust increase in conceptual representation, then that is when we get the LATL increase. So it seems that the LATL is a semantic combinatorial machine whose operation seems to be sensitive to the complexity of composition. And also it seems that the LATL closely tracks conceptual aspects of its operands. So my doctoral work with Liina has focused on this question. How does composition outside the noun domain engage the LATL? And I have been particularly interested in the verb domain. And there's a good reason why I have been interested in the verb domain. So verb is another major lexical category in natural language. So it's full of meaning. So we can do a kind of similar manipulation as in the noun domain. Also, and we tend to think that verbs and nouns are 2 different things, and they are. But actually, at the compositional aspect, formal semantics puts forward a hypothesis that verb combination into the phrase and noun combination must employ the same type of role. So for example, if I'm going to combine read and boat, then the formal semantic way to do this is as follows. So read refers to all things in the world that are read, and boat refers to all things that are boat in this world. And via the rule that's called predicate modification in Hyman-Kratzer framework, you concatenate like the 2 properties and you derive their intersection. So you end up with all things that are both red and also bold. And crucially, for the event domain, you exactly do the same operation. So here, slowly refers to all events that are slow, and walk is walking event. So you end up with all events that are slow walking events. So given that, so like essentially like this predicate modification that formal semantics say is abstracted away from its grammatical content, right? Grammatical category of the words. So like a logical consequence from this type of framework is that there might be a unified neural basis for both types of modification, even though they are very different in terms of conceptual content and grammatical properties, because they might just do the same type of operations, which is something like predicate modification. But however, there is another type of perspective. Especially because we know from the neuroimaging literature that verb and noun are not exactly the same in the brain. This might be the case. So, for example, from clinical research, we know that a patient can have a selective deficit in either verb or noun. And also in healthy population, we know that the event concept that referred to by verbs and the noun concepts are localized to different areas of the brain. We also know that it's not moving. Okay. So we know that some sensory motor features that constitute a concept engage different areas of the brain. So it's like really embodied. So for example, like sound and motion might localize to different areas of the brain. And, given that events and objects engage, they are made up of very different spatial contents. It might be the case, it is the case that verb and noun are localized to different areas in the brain. And along this line, some researchers have suggested that conceptual combination in the event domain also might localize to different areas, such as the left angular gyrus, then the LATL. So like in that type of perspective, it might be the case that we do not see the left ATL engagement for the verb modification, or it might be engaged, but in a more unfamiliar way. So my first study just aimed to answer this question. So I combined adverb and verb, like just as much in the previous studies in the noun domain. So I just want to walk you through into the world of adverb semantics because they are interesting. So I had 3 different types of adverbs in my study, and let's just think about this painting event. So event is usually a multi-componential entity, conceptual entity. So there is first, for example, this person who is doing the painting action, and there's this action part with arm and hands. There's also this tool. There's also this theme argument, which is created as a result of the action. And it is possible to modify those different components selectively with different types of adverbs. So if I say slowly paints, slowly is a manner adverb, and it refers to the speed of the brushing action, probably. If I say reluctantly paints, then reluctantly does not refer to the action itself, because action itself cannot be reluctant. Rather, what's reluctant is the person, the agent argument here. If I say vividly paints, then it's not about the person. A person cannot be vivid, an action cannot be vivid. But what is vivid is the result state of this theme argument, a picture here. So you can see how these 2 types of adverbs can be different from this manner adverb, which I'll call eventive adverb in this talk. So in Goiter's work, these 2 types of adverbs are named participant-oriented adverbs because their meaning is oriented to event participants, such as theme or agent. And like a crucial property of them is that these two types of adverbs are derived from base adjective, reluctant or vivid, which are inherently a property of an individual or object, but not an event. So the consequence is that their composition with the verb is likely to be more complicated because they are referring to some object, but they are actually modifying, syntactically combining with a verb. So there's this kind of a semantic kind of a mismatch. So there's some like formal semantic notation that might help you understand this point. So slowly paints can be represented as something like this. There is a paint event, and that event is slow. That's all I have to say, but that is not as simple for reluctantly paints because it's not the event that is reluctant. So instead, you should say something like this. There's a painting event, and there's also a state where the reluctant property holds, and that state is experienced by the agent of the event. So it's more complicated. Similarly, for vividly paints, you have to think about this kind of a sub-event which the vivid property holds, and there the theme arguments of the event exists in that state. So bottom line is that it's more complicated to derive their meaning. So here, if you remember the complexity effect from the noun domain, I want to test the effect of modifier complexity on the LATL computational activity. So yeah, I asked whether does the adverbial modification engage the LATL in a similar fashion as shown for the adjectival modification. And by similar fashion, I mean only a relatively straight modifier elicits increased LATL activity. And here, the relatively straightforward is the eventive one. So we had these 4 types of adverbs: agentive, resultative, eventive, and no adverb condition. And no adverb condition has like this non-pronounceable consonant string so that there's no composition going on. And we had the same verb. So if the LATL does does engage in a modification in a similar way in the verb domain as well, then we'll see like this type of activity pattern. So it'll be the eventive I, which elicits more activity, at least against this no adverb baseline. However, that's not the sole prediction. If LATL is more like shows a more complexity-driven pattern, as shown in the noun literature for the right ATL, then we might see this type of pattern where vividly and reluctantly show more activity in the LATL because they are more complicated. And thirdly, it might be the case that LATL is just not sensitive to adverb semantics. So in that case, you wouldn't see any distinction between like these 3 adverbs. And just before we get to the results, I just want to mention that we did a separate norming experiment on Amazon Mechanical Turk to verify that these 3 adverbs are really different. And this was kind of a challenge for us because adverb interpretation is generally very versatile, very flexible. So we really needed to confirm that they are really interpreted differently. So, to recall that, these 3 adverbs has different targets of modification. So we constructed 3 types of paraphrases, which highlights different targets. So for example, if I say the painter was reluctant, here the base adjective is directly predicated of the painter. So the painter was reluctant should be a good paraphrase for this phrase, reluctantly paints. But the picture was reluctant is not a good one for this. And also like the painting went reluctantly, which is kind of really highlights like the progression of events, is not the best one for the reluctantly paints. So we asked participants to judge whether each of these paraphrases is a good match, a good description of the phrase on the left. And we expected that for reluctantly paints, it should be the agent-centered one that gets like a highest rate of acceptance of of match response. And similarly for vividly, paints, it should be the theme-centered thing as paraphrase that should get the highest match response. And similarly for slowly paints, it should be the event-centered one. And it was precisely the case. So for the event agent adverb, reluctantly paints, it was the agent-centered paraphrase that got a higher response than the other two. For the resultative adverb, it was the theme-centered one. For eventive adverb, it was the event-centered one. So we confirmed that these three types of adverbs were really interpreted in different ways. All right, so let's get to the results from the LATL. And these were like the three types of outcomes that we expected. And I'm going to show you the results. So this is from the three Broadband areas in the FDATL. And you are looking at like the time series during the verb presentation, verb reading. So we found a cluster showing the effect of adverbs at like 280 milliseconds to like 300 milliseconds. And the pattern was that the eventive adverb show like the largest separation against almost all the other conditions. So if we zoom in onto this figure, then in pairwise comparison, you can see that eventive elicit more activity than no adverb baseline. So it seems that the first set of results shows support for this first hypothesis. And we also look into the right ATL because of the results. It's showing like a more complexity driven pattern. Like complex things engage RATL more, right? So that was actually the case in the verb domain as well. So here, like the three patterns are almost all the same. So you can see that it's the agentive adverb that show more activity than other conditions. And in pairwise comparison, we can see that agentive elicits more activity, especially against the resultative or eventive. So it shows that the RATL showed like a more complexity-driven pattern, but in a partial sense, because it's not the case that both of the agentive and resultative showed more activity against no adverb. So it seems that there's still like further distinction between these two types of participant-oriented adverbs. And we looked into other areas such as left angular gyrus and left inferior frontal gyrus, which have been implicated for verb processing in general. And here, we didn't find any effect of adverb type, let alone the pure composition effect. So you can see like there's no much cluster here. So it seems that like the modification doesn't really engage these types of other ROIs. And this type of research, this type of finding is consistent with what we found more recently, which was published in Brain Language. So in this research, we looked into verb argument composition. So we just made up simple 3-word sentences where subject, verb, and object are combined. And we had 3 conditions, like there were others, but I'm just highlighting this here. So like condition 1 has kids, which is like a more general, conceptually general noun, and we had a more specific one, but like this difference doesn't really concern us for this talk. And at the third condition, we had those 3 hashtags for visual stimulation. And so essentially there was no actual subject. And we were interested what's happening at the verb time window. So does the presence or absence of subject affect the processing in the verb time frame? And this is a timeline from left BA 38, the temporal poll. And here's the verb time. Then you can see that the no subject condition, which is a gray line, is separated from the other 2 conditions. And this effect cannot be coming from any other places than the subject, because after the subject in all 3 conditions, you are exactly reading the same stimulus. So this effect is definitely coming from the subject. And like in other parts of the LATL, we basically got the same result, and also from the mid-superior temporal cortex, which has been implicated for thematic role type of processing, not in the left angular gyrus. So you can see like there's stark absence of any composition activity. And you can see that during the verb, during the subject, the left angular gyrus does separate some subject and no subject. So it does process the subject, but not at the next word. So it definitely shows that the left angular gyrus is not really integrating the previously presented information. So yeah, verb argument composition also localized to the LATL. And this finding might come across a little more surprising than the modification finding, because the LAG has been implicated for like more thematic type of relation or processing around those type of like a function application type of combination. Okay, so here's a summary. Only the eventive adverbs elicited a significantly increased LATL activity against a non-combinatory condition. This pattern suggests that the modification computation in the LATL is of cross-categorical nature. And the RATL showed a distinct complexity-driven pattern at the same time window, and no composition effect was found in other candidate regions. Okay, so going back to this figure, it seems that like the results support like the first type of more or less unified neural basis hypothesis. All right, that was study one. So after getting results, I thought about what is really causing the absence of the LATL effect for participant-oriented adverbs. So now you know that these two adverbs are more complicated and they are distinguished from slowly. So there might be a couple of reasons, potential reasons why these two guys don't really engage the LATL. First, participant-oriented adverbs might need participants in the stimulus, because even the participants are crucial elements for their composition, and that was absent in our two-word stimulus. So maybe that's why. And if that's the case, once we provide those event participants in our stimulus overtly, then they might engage the LATL. Or participant-oriented adverbs might just be too complicated. So we know that complexity matters for the LATL. And even though there are participants, they are, if you remember the formal semantic notation, their meaning is just more complicated than for the manner adverb. So if that is the case, then even though you provide participants in the stimulus, these two guys will not still engage the LATL. So my second experiment wanted to distinguish between these two hypotheses. Okay, so this is what we had previously, and now we have the theme agent argument and also the theme argument. And the first question is just as I already explained. It focused on the verb time window. So for example, now that reluctantly has all the necessary ingredients like the domain, reluctantly, and pains, will it elicit more activity in the LATL at the verb, unlike in the previous literature and previous study? So that was the first type of question. And we have a second type of question. In this talk, I'm going to focus on this type of question. So what's happening during the verb now that we have the man before reluctantly? So previously, we didn't have anything before the adverb, but now we have the agent. So it might be the case that reluctantly now can do some composition with the man, right? But the problem is that the man and reluctantly do not form any syntactic constituent. So So they do not form any phrase. And so this is different from all the other the stimulus from all the previous literature on language on LATL, where they only just investigated full phrase, like a fully intact phrase. So the question was, does the LATL combinatory computation require syntactic constituency? Like it's an interesting question, especially we know that the LATL is really a semantic operator. So we are curious whether like syntactic constituency matters at all for to engage the LATL in the composition. So we had this type of active sentences, and in this case, we had this type of non-compositional baseline. So it's not non-compositional, but it didn't have any content for adverb. And we had two types of predictions. If the LATL is operating some kind of a no constituent composition, so it can compose two words even though they are not forming any constituent, then reluctantly you will see this type of pattern. So agent condition will elicit more activity than others. If constituents does matter, so like LATL cannot compose these two because there's no constituency formed as yet, then you wouldn't see any composition effect at the adverb. We also had a passive construction so that we can study the composition between picture and vividly now. And similarly, we have two types of outcome predictions on the outcome. Okay. We had a control condition, which I call no subject condition. So no subject condition was very similar to active condition, also to the passive condition, but it didn't have anything like before it, the adverb. So the reason why I had this this condition was to confirm any effects that I might find in the active or passive is really due to the presence of the preceding argument, right? So if I find, for example, like no constituent composition pattern for the active and also for the no subject, then I cannot really say that this is due to the combination between the main and reluctantly. So that was the purpose of having that condition. And I'm now going to show you the results. So remember, these are our two outcomes. And this is the timeline. So here, 0 millisecond is the onset of the adverb, like reluctantly, slowly, vividly, and had. And we had two different clusters. In first cluster, the average activity was like this. So it basically does the distinction between all the adverbs versus no adverb, right? So it seems that at this point, the LATL is distinguishing like some contentful adverbs against all the others. And in the second cluster, and actually the event is going the magnitude is going negative because we used like fixed orientation for immediate source reconstruction. But you can just take the absolute magnitude as before. So the pattern is a little complicated, but it's actually a combination of two types of effects. The first one is all three adverbs eliciting more absolute activity compared to no adverb. And the second is that agentive adverb elicit more activity than all the other conditions, like here, here, and here, right? So that is precisely this this pattern, like no constituent composition. So it seems that there's actually more activity going on for the agentive when there was an agent preceding. And in the passive condition, we expected like larger increase for resultative if these two can somehow integrate. And this is what we got. Again, like adverb with time window. And precisely we got that type of effect. So now it's the resultative adverb eliciting largest increase, especially against these two conditions. So again, it seems to support the no constituent composition. And in the no subject control condition, we saw like one cluster where there was only a distinction between all adverbs versus no adverb. So it's not like either the agent active or passive condition. So it seems that the results overall support no constituent composition hypothesis. Okay, so I'm gonna summarize study 2. So a significantly increased LATL activity was elicited at the participant-oriented adverbs if the adverb was preceded by relevant event participant. And this result suggests that the LATL can operate even in the absence of local syntactic constituency of its operands. And I want to close this talk by revisiting this figure. So we already knew that red boat type of composition engaged the LATL. And what I showed is that whatever neural activity that we found in the LATL for this red and boat, it's not exclusive to this object domain. It extends to verb domain in a very parallel and comparable way. So at 200 to 300 milliseconds, LATL exhibits sensitivity to modifier semantics in both the noun and verb modification in a parallel way. It supports that it shows that the LATL does not merely engage for both noun and verb phrase composition, but it also performs a rather similar function for the two categories. And the precise nature of what the rather similar function is still a very it's a topic of a very active research. And I just talked about like predicate modification, but we already know that it's not merely predicate modification either. Like it's very sensitive to conceptual increase, and there might be other kind of models which can, capture this kind of dynamics. Also, composition of event concepts localizes to the LATL, but not to other areas, posterior areas such as left angular gyrus. So it seems that, so I just want to emphasize that like my findings does not deny or refute any prior existing findings about the engagement of LAG in events processing in various aspects. It just shows that, even though like the LAG is very much active in processing various aspects of event concept, it's surprisingly quiet on the compositional front when you really isolate the composition operation in a very mechanistic way. So I think there's this separation between like the compositional operation per se and what is being composed, like what is the substrate of the operation. In sentential context, the patterns in the LATL activity indicated an integration between words that do not form a syntactic constituent. And that activity appeared in a quite later timing than the other condition of the other studies. And this is kind of a take-home message. LATL is a cross-categorical hub of semantic composition, which can operate even in the absence of a local syntactic constituency. And that's all I prepared for today. Thank you for listening.
Great, thank you, Liina. Thank you, Songhee. I think it was a terrific talk, very beautiful introduction from Liina, and thank you very much for really taking good care of questions we were posing. I think it was exactly what we meant to have in our talks. We have time for a couple of questions, and I'm sure from our side and from other people around here on Zoom and on YouTube, I can see there are already some questions been posted, and just to mention, we're more than 150 people across the different platforms. So we can begin with the first questions from. We got a question from where we give precedence to junior researchers, or maybe Philip Kunke would like to turn the microphone on and ask the questions directly if you want, or I can read it for you. It would be nice to increase dynamics.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Perfectly, Philip. Thank you very much.
Great. Yeah, thanks for the fantastic 2 talks. That was really insightful and super interesting data. So I guess this kind of more relates to Leina Pylkkäsen's part in the beginning, where she mentioned that the left ATL is not sensitive to non-linguistic composition, right? In the sense that only in the production part, I think only when you need to produce the label of a picture, a red boat or whatever, then you see the ATL becoming active, and not for purely perceiving a non-linguistic picture composition, let's say. So as you already alluded, this kind of conflicts with the typical Lamb and Ralph view, right? That the left ATL is like a general conceptual semantic hub. So I was wondering, how sure are you that this is indeed the same region? In the sense that, so in the first part, it looked like it's more on the your ATL region is more on the lateral surface, whereas I think in the second part of Songhee it was also the ventral ATL. But what the proponents of the ATL view often say, of course, is that it's mainly the ventral ATL, right? The ITG fusiform gyrus part, that is kind of the core of the hub, the most supramotor part, and then maybe you have some kind of graded organization where, as you move more laterally, the ATL might be biased towards language, right? So would you say this is kind of consistent with this view, or would you rather like go a step further and even propose that ATL is language specific, or at least certain parts of the ATL?
Okay, so that was a lot of things, and so let me try to take that from the top. So I mentioned those 2 studies, which is a small amount of data from us, right? Only because you guys posed that question to us, and I often see conversation, you know, on Twitter about this question, and people kind of just take it for granted that the ATL is, you know, a general, you know, not at all specific linguistic hub, and that does seem, you know, is probably right. So then I think we should be really curious about this kind of finding. And so it's not the case that the ATL doesn't engage for those stimuli. It does engage, but it doesn't show the composition effect that we see for the kind of parallel linguistic stimulus. And so I see that as like an interesting puzzle that you could try to unpack. And, you know, I'm not making any claims about it. I'm just saying, like, isn't this kind of interesting? Like, you could work on this. Like, there's a starting point for maybe unpacking something quite interesting. You know, if my like feeling for the, you know, ATL and the types of paradigms that we've used is that it's kind of like it's this obligatory stop on the bus route for the linguistic stimulus, and the signal arrives there at 200 milliseconds ish. That's where it's like a very kind of like a time locked response, and at that point it has this kind of like combinatory potential if the circumstances are right, like you've sufficiently accessed the meanings of the words, you've had enough time to appreciate them. At that point, you know, some kind of composition can lock, but if the stimulus isn't clear enough yet, then that hub does not get used or something like this. And so it could really be very sensitive to exactly what the input is. And, you know, so I just think there's a lot to be worked out yet. So definitely I'm not claiming anything about it. I think there's a really interesting puzzle. About the localization, so from MEG, we get some localization, but we don't get great localization, right? And so, our results, for example, one of the challenges is that, it kind of, our effects kind of move around. They're sort of in the front half of the temporal lobe, but not always in the same spot. So that's hard to kind of like reconcile across studies. Now, I have one current student, Graham Flick, who's really trying to seriously like characterize all the crosstalk functions in the MEG signal localization. And so he has a paper coming out soon that I think will be, useful and kind of a step forward in that front. But, we just have to keep in mind MEG, it's kind of source modeling, it's a model, and there's some issues in that localization. So yeah, can't make a strong claim about that.
Fantastic, thank you.
Thanks.
All right, thanks, Philip. Thanks, Liina, for answering. We have another question from Joan Valle-Lisboa. Maybe you can turn them.
I'm here.
Okay, great. We perfectly hear you.
So first, thank you for the wonderful talks and data. I think that this is very cool, and we try to do something like this in EEG in our country. I wonder what happens with the linguistic theory after these results. Every new experiment shows that some of the representations that come from linguistic theory, like the constituency trees and whatever, are not found in the. I mean, I know other papers showing other cool stuff, like the Deng paper with the oscillations showing that you can log to this one syllable word sentences. But this seems to show that in order to process language, you are not using any of this cool linguistic tree, but just adding new information to the concepts and so on. What kind of linguistic theory would be compatible with that kind of experiment? I kept thinking after one result after the other,
Yeah, so if we don't find evidence for a computation that linguistic theory posits, it of course does not mean anything about the existence or non-existence of that computation. It just means that we fail to find a trace of that with the specific method that we use to measure the brain and the specific analysis that we did. And there's a million other things that you could have done. And so there's never any conclusion about the things we didn't see. We just didn't happen to see them. It is interesting, maybe for a linguist it's interesting, but maybe for a non-linguist it's kind of obvious that, the kind of easiest signal that we observed with the techniques that we happen to be using is this more conceptually driven activity. And so it does invite you to maybe think about ways in which that type of computation could be integrated into linguistic theory. And so, of course, ultimately, and I think we would all agree, ultimately, we want to have, a single theory of language, and it happens in the brain. So it's going to be a neural theory ultimately, like no matter what method you're using, whether you're measuring judgments or reaction times, you're measuring the brain. I assume we're all going towards that. So ultimately, we'd like to have a neural theory of both the representation, so our static knowledge, and the dynamic operations that, presumably take some of that stored information as its input. And so now, I think we're starting to have some kind of a characterization of a process that seems to be operating both during comprehension and during production. We didn't really talk about that part today. And so I think that's going to be part of the picture. And so now what we saw in Songhee's dissertation work, but now also a current student of mine, Alicia Parrish, has new results that are going to be interesting and relevant. So the left A-tail mechanism, it seems to be able to do, some flavor of conceptual combination, even when there's not kind of a local merge. So it's able to combine concepts that are far apart and they're not syntactically merging. What Alicia Parrish's work is going to show, and her first paper is about to come out in the neurobiology of language in the journal, is that you get, so let's just say you're stacking modifiers and there's not a local merge, it's like this. So it's like a list of modifiers. They're not going together locally. So you can get a left ATL composition effect, even if they're like this. Mm-hmm. But if they also are locally merging, then it is a higher signal. So it's like, it does like it if they're like, if all the evidence is converging. So, yeah, so I think that ultimate, integration of the neural data with linguistics, it's really hard, partly because the people are different, but I think we can, slowly go towards it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I also want to add to that, because, our story is only from the LATL, and there are other brain regions which shows like the sign of a merge, and which might be more suitable for other types of linguistic theory. So just remind that this is only a story from very focal region, which is LATL.
We do, analyze more than the left ATL. So
yeah, but
you showed us a broader set of regions, so it's not the case, but.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Right, maybe, yes, we have another couple of questions. I think we have room for 2 or 3 more questions. Yeah, 2, 3 more questions. I guess maybe I'd like to wrap up your idea, Liina, about representations and the work from Songhee that has been presented, and at the same time, the idea that the observation that it's really hard to integrate neural data with linguistics. I'm also wondering about also taking into account, works from Brennan, for example, how far we can go with computational modeling informativity. I mean, we're working online. We see some effects at the verb or the adverb. If we can integrate any role of the ATL that has not to do with linguistics per se, but with concepts like prediction or integration, that would help us. Let's put it this way: how coherent would your results be when we include computational modeling on the data? So, what the effects that we see in your studies can tell us something about conceptual prediction or conceptual integration in a more refined and mathematically defined modeling.
Mm-hmm. I can take that.
Yeah, you both free to answer, of course. So,
yeah,
thank you.
So I think almost any hypothesis that posits a region, some type of combinatory role, whether it's in terms of conceptual combination, logical semantic composition, syntactic composition, you're going to get traction from that region if you have a computational model that represents composition. So it's probably, no matter what the parsing steps are, you'll probably get some amount of say fit or correlation with that model. So then I think the question really is, so I would say that, all the techniques are complementary, the more different angles we approach the problem from, the better. So let me just put that on the, on the table. But when we're applying a computational model and we're asking how well does it explain the data, we should, be happy to have a winner. So we're okay, here's the winning model, great. But that should in some sense be the starting point, not the end point. So now okay, this seems to have some explanatory power. Now, how can we modify the model, or, how can we make that fit even better? So you kind of have to push past the theories and the models that you already had on the shelf going into it, because I think the assumption that we have the right theory or cognitive model already is a little crazy. Surely we don't have it, surely we don't have the right linguistic theory. We don't have the right any theory. We have to keep looking for the right theory. And it would be really exciting if we can use brain data to try to push us towards the right theory. But we do have to use the theories we already have to go towards it. But then we have to have some kind of hopefully we're learning something new about language by studying the brain. I mean, that's the holy grail, but let's go for it.
Maybe Songhee, thank you, Liina. Maybe any comment on that, Songhee, as well? Otherwise,
no, that was
All right. So because
Yeah.
this makes also, I have to say, I very much like this idea of this straightforward composition you've been talking about. I wouldn't say a good enough way of working on it, but it's really, for me, it's very interesting to see what is straightforward. I was very convinced by the data. I'm really trying to understand how we can really say, okay, this is straightforward, this is not. It seems that it goes for the simple solution. Would that be the case, that the ATL just takes for granted within 200 milliseconds what the easiest is to process? Anything more complex has to be passed to something else. Is that the idea of straightforward composition that you have? Anything that I can get like very quick pace is fine, then the rest gets more complicated.
Yeah. I think there's two kind of sources of literature that can be helpful in thinking about it, but I do think it's something we have to discover and figure out. But so from formal semantics, you do get hypotheses about when, you know, composition is straightforward or kind of direct, and that is something that was very relevant for Songhee's work. So there's like, well, here you have an, you know, eventive adverb. The adverb slowly, it is telling you something about the property of the event that the verb describes. So those properties are very adjacent and capable of merging. Okay. Whereas something like, you know, vividly paints, well, it's, you know, something else is vivid. The resultant picture is the vivid thing. It's not like, not a direct, you can't directly just put those two meanings together. You have to kind of like consult broader context. So that's something that you can kind of, you can imagine how you could formalize that. So it seems like that's relevant. And then the other thing that seems to be relevant is something that I think, you know, Songhee's current postdoc mentor, Jeff Binder, has kind of insightfully written about, which is that some, you know, like how quickly you can extract lexical meaning from the current element, I think is relevant, and it's probably relevant for the specificity facts. So something like, you know, a more specific meaning, maybe it takes a little bit longer for you to truly access that meaning. And so it's like how quickly you extract the semantic content is probably important for whether the left ATL can then actually combine meanings. So obviously you have to have a meaning first before you can combine it. So.
Would this, this is rather curiosity now, would that mirror language acquisition in some sense? I don't know if you have been bothering yourself about that question, whether simple meanings in a way or another develop earlier than more complex meaning, and adverbs can be a very nice continuum in that sense. And probably ATL would suggest that something about how simpler meaning develop earlier. And of course, you know that there is a noun-verb asymmetry, but some auxiliaries may show up, or some very simple verbs may show up and build on that. So probably acquisition would be probably continuum to look at. And probably I have to say I very much like the straightforward definition, and I think we should work a lot on how to define what straightforward might be. And I guess we could learn a lot from acquisition as well. Are you into any acquisition data of any sort, especially from production, of course? This seems to be really much the case.
Yeah, I have a project that I've been trying to kind of pitch in my seminars, but no one's like grabbed it yet. So I'm actually very interested in the relationship between kind of telegraphic speech of the sort that, you know, language impaired individuals will kind of resort to, or, you know, like when our linguistic system starts to be impaired, the kind of telegraphic speech where the functional elements start to be dropped is something that seems to emerge. And also in acquisition, you know, the way a 2-year-old speaks is, you know, like, you know, mommy cookie, or, you know, like where there's these kind of very grammatically impoverished expressions. You know, so the question is, could that be in some sense, you know, maybe just the left ATL operating without yet the full grammatical knowledge being hung on to that? And so yeah, I have thought about that. I'm interested in exploring that domain further, and especially like the connections. Like then, you know, if there is, you know, impairment to the system, the fact that again we go into those kinds of expressions, I think that's very interesting.
All right, thank you. I think we have one more question from the audience, then 2 general questions. I hope you're patient enough to get these 3 more questions. I guess one last question from the audience is from Giorgio. Maybe Giorgio, you can speak up.
So thanks for the talk. One question for Songhee, and you presented us this nice categorization of the adverbs between agentive, eventive, or resultive. And I was wondering if in the ratings that you collected, it was always clear, the categorization. So if an adverb was always only, let's say, agentive, or if it was sometimes ambiguous, and if there is a way to take this ambiguity into account, because maybe I guess that could also be relevant to think of semantic categories not as closed spaces, but something that can actually maybe change from one context to the others. And yeah, I think that one syntactic phenomenon that could also be related to these, that sometimes it has been studied, is these garden path sentences, where depending on how you interpret the syntactic structure, you have a different meaning associated to it, and maybe there is also a way to build some sort of garden path in this context, where in some cases one adverb which is ambiguous is exclusively agentive, and in another case exclusively resultive, for example.
Yeah. I don't have the like scatter plot that I made once for the like individual ratings, but there were definitely some more like tricky items, like some for example, like some adverbs in the resultative category are like less canonically resultative, but at the group level they were like reasonably distinctive. Statistically, their ratings were distinguishable, you know, as a group level. So and it was actually really a real challenge to find like enough number. Like we had like 25 of adverbs in each category, and it was really hard to find like the like 75 adverbs which are controlled in every other aspect, and they're like really distinguished in terms of their semantics. But there were definitely, you know, like those individual differences, the goodness of fit difference. And I also want to mention that the resultatives, as we also, you know, find some difference between agentive and resultative in the right ATL. And it seems that like resultative especially can be perceived like less good compared to other adverbs, because they are like generated like syntactically in the lower place, and so maybe it's not their like preferred position that they come before the verb. So actually, in the second study, we did the same type of norming, and we also like collected ratings for their grammaticality, and there were actually, you know, some difference in their naturalness. So we just tested whether there's any statistical evidence that the difference matters, and it didn't. But there are, you know, some differences that I didn't really mention in the talk. Yeah.
Okay, thank you a lot.
Right, thank you, Giorgio. Thanks, Songhee. One very quick question from Matteo, and then 2 general questions. Then we are really over. Matteo, yes?
Yes. Thank you both for your talk. I really liked it. I wanted to ask which you think it could be the limit of the 2-word level of observation. For example, I see that in the first study you said that the 2-word level, and then you had the need to add some more words to address some research questions. And I was also thinking about this at the theoretical level, because when we focus about syntactic composition, we assume a mechanism that in a sense is binary, like merge. You take 2 elements, take 2 elements, take 2 elements, and build complex structures. And I was wondering if the same binary operation is assumed also at the conceptual level, or if there will be the need to go beyond the two-word level, maybe 3, 4, and then really test if the assumptions hold even at more complex levels and structures.
Yeah, so we definitely, have many studies that are not two-word studies, but, for any given presentation, you have to kind of like trim the thing. And so Songhee, for example, showed a 3-word study in this presentation. And so I have to say that, so, on the one hand, like I pursued like the naturalistic method, starting with John Brennan, and, like that has its own, own rules. And then when we have incrementally built on the 2-word paradigm, you definitely see that things get quickly much more complicated. So like Linman Zhang's dissertation, for example, explored those specificity effects at the sentence level, while also varying negation in a really linguistically informed way. So that's something, I think, a really cool study that I would invite people to check out. She was really creative about experimental design. So things generalize, but instantly get more complicated. One interesting observation that one can already see in Songhee's extension to a 3-word stimulus is that inside a sentence, the left ATL combinatory facts tend to be a little later. That's surprising, because you think that you'd like get faster when it's a bigger context. And so like Songhee, isn't it the case that your subject integration effects on the verb, they're like more 300, 350?
Yeah, after 300 milliseconds.
And so, yeah, so it does change, but that's another thing to kind of try to understand. But it's tractable.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
All right, thanks, Matteo. Thanks, Liina, for answering. So 2 very general questions that we are just asking. So we are towards the end of the talk. We are happy to ask these 2 general questions to our invited speakers. They are the same for all of them. And the first is for our senior researcher. And the very general question is, what is the most important challenge for the field in the next 5 years? For you, what do you think, Liina, is the biggest challenge for all of us, neurolinguists, language psychologists, or neuroscientists in general, or interested in language? Thank you.
So I think
then we go to Songhee from us. Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah. It's hard to pick any one thing. And of course, we have many challenges that are not specific to our field, but sort of sticking more to challenges that are kind of properties of our own field right now. I do think that, and also 5 years is a short period of time. So it's like, what can you do in 5 years?
We could say 10. We could say 10 if it's easier.
Okay. But I do think it's really important that we kind of follow through on our findings. So when we kind of look at let's just say syntax, semantics, cognitive neuroscience literature, we don't have a lot of examples where there's like an initial discovery and then like a real systematic investigation that tries to unpack it. And obviously, I have tried to do that kind of a research program because you like really want to find out what's going on. And so I really would encourage anyone who has a finding that you're excited about, if you think like, okay, this is really starting to like get at the question that I'm excited about, really try to pursue that as a research program, in a sense, pushing it past the theories that you started with. So design experiments that are, aimed to falsify your current favorite hypothesis about what that activity might reflect. And, like even in 5 years, if everybody did that, I think we would learn a lot. And so, always having like contrasting hypotheses, so not, can't be a one hypothesis pony, like this hypothesis, and see how many hypotheses you can eliminate from the table, because that's basically the exercise. So we have a lot of hypotheses on the table, and we have to get rid of, some. And so that kind of follow through, I think, is important. And it is a challenge. And the reason that it is a challenge is because, for one thing, funding mechanisms often do not encourage that type of incremental research. So lots of funding mechanisms are, they really invite transformative research. Every time you're supposed to reinvent yourself every 5 years. And if you're doing that, well, then you are not really pursuing a question in a systematic fashion for a long time. You also have to be open to, not replicating yourself. It has to be part of the exercise. And I mean, so that's why it's not the obviously easy thing to do. So that, and maybe those are reasons why we don't see it as much as we probably should. I do want to mention that the classic ERP literature did this very well. Like, Angela, so she has a model, and they're like, there was like sustained series of experiments that were trying to hone in on what a certain effect actually reflected. And in some sense, I would like to see some revival of that these days.
I think that's a great answer, and thanks for putting together consistency and grant applications, which is a major problem. And I'm sure you are probably the most consistent scientist in language that we know, given the systematicity that you have been now developing since, I'd say, Bemis and Pylkkänen in 2011. So I can confirm that you are following this systematicity, and that makes a lot of sense. Thanks, Liina. The last question is for Songhee, and the question is, how can junior researchers contribute to solving this challenge? So Liina has been talking now. I just wrap up very quickly that one has to be very, very consistent and try to test empirical hypotheses, a bunch of empirical hypotheses that you might put forward in the previous experiment. How would you like to contribute to solving the challenge of understanding how language and brain might work together? So what's your plan in the next 5 to 10 years, for example?
It's a big question. Yeah, I definitely agree that we have to, I like the idea of starting with some, for example, linguistically guided theory, and then we learn something and we made some modification to the theory that we started with. So I think that is a very good way to consistently move along, and make progress, and increasingly, increase your knowledge. Also, I think it's important to be try to be exhaustive as much as possible when you're making your hypothesis space. So for example, I start with hypothesis 1 and hypothesis 2, and my result is more consistent with hypothesis 1. So that is, I might say, okay, so this supports hypothesis 2, but what if there were hypothesis 3? Then I'm really kind of converging onto a slightly wrong type of conclusion. So I think it's really important to try to be exhaustive when you're dividing the hypothesis space, and try to get out of your theoretical framework that you come with, and just consult more other types of composition, for example, what other people say about the mechanism of composition and models of composition, alternative models of them. So yeah, that's my answer.
Oh, thank you, and that's a very good answer, and good luck with your future, of course, and with your new work in Wisconsin. Okay, so I think we are, wow, it's exactly 4:30 here in Leipzig. I think it was a great talk. We were very much looking forward to hearing Liina and Songhee. So thank you very much, both of you, for joining the talk today. Thanks to all the audience. Before concluding, I hope to see you on June 30, 2021 at 1 p.m. UTC. And we're going to have a very new interesting tandem, new interesting talk with Molly Flaherty and Susan Golden Meadow from Davidson College and University of Chicago. And with this, I would like to thank you very much. Thanks again, Liina and Songhee, for the incredible talk, and hope to see you all in 2 weeks. Again, 1 p.m. UTC. Okay, thank you very much. and bye-bye.